Wonderful to be here, and thank you all for making time to come along to this event. I just thought before I'd start by reading a little bit from the Guardian Review article to contextualize my recent poems. I'll actually start with a quote or two from Jay Bernard's piece in the Poetry Review. Jay Bernard is a poet and also a wonderful programmer and also a performer. And I think Jay actually worked with Eric in our department, in the English department here, on a project. So Jay is a friend and also just a Black British poet that I really admire. And in a piece called Stranger in the Archives that they wrote for the Poetry Review, I think back in 2018, they posed a few questions that I think still animate their work and also mine. In their piece, they say, a poet can't deliver justice, but they can ask a different kind of question. Later on, Jay quotes David Mura and says, what does it mean when poets surrender vast realms of experience to journalists, to political scientists, economists? What does it mean when we allow the objectivity of these disciplines to be the sole voice which speaks on events and topics of relevance to us all? And I think, especially in the wake of COVID, I've been thinking a lot about these quotes and thinking about how, as poets and as writers, we might often be seen as writing from the subjective point of view and often commenting on things that don't pertain to society or pertain to politics, more broadly speaking. But I actually think that that dichotomy between the self and society is actually a false one. And so I'll just quickly read from my Guardian Review article to give a bit of context for the poems that I'll read to you in a moment. So the piece I wrote for The Guardian was actually a commission, and I had about 12 hours to turn it around. So it was a sort of quickly written piece, if you will. I just wrote from the heart because I didn't have much time. I was asked to consider the role that poetry might play in a crisis. And that brought me back to 2003, when I was a teenager in Hong Kong and actually went through the SARS epidemic. I was 13 and I had to go to school in a face mask. Schools didn't shut during that period, but it was definitely a huge sense of crisis because we'd never faced anything like this before. And my father's a doctor, so also he would come home in PPE, and that was quite a traumatizing experience, if you will. So I reflect a little bit on that in this piece, which I'll read briefly to you. In the days after the arrival of COVID-19 in the UK, I watched in horror as government policy failed to mobilize the public. I tried to write, but found myself unable to express something that might be of use. As a poet, I could not muster the right words. On 13th of March, I realized that a prose poem of mine titled Safe Space 2 from my debut collection Flesh was being shared widely on Twitter. It begins, wash your hands, rub soap into foam into lost hands. Focus on the running tap, the way your hands momentarily disappear and you feel safe again. The bathroom is a place you can always rely on in whatever country. I realized for the first time that this was a SARS poem, which had not occurred to me when I first wrote it in 2017. I was 12 years old when the SARS epidemic hit Hong Kong, my home city, in 2003. School meant mandatory medical kits that our teachers inspected every day at the start of class, 2 face masks, a bottle of hand sanitizer. I knew SARS was serious because of how my father reacted to the news early on in the crisis. I remember him leaving for work in an N95 mask and returning home with the outline of the mask imprinted on his cheek. One day, he came home uncharacteristically quiet. He told us that a friend and colleague who had been working on the front line in a local hospital had lost his life to SARS. In the weeks after, I developed a habit of feverishly washing my hands. As an only child, I turned to books for some sorely needed comfort. Afterwards, I declared to my parents one evening that I wanted to be a writer. My father replied, "As a doctor, you can cure one person at a time. As a writer, you might heal a whole society." Something about the specificity of poetry allows it to crystallize experience, as if one were pausing time. The brevity of a poem and its precision helps us tune out the world and its excesses, so we might return, if only momentarily, to ourselves. As more and more people practice social distancing, what we don't do becomes just as important as what we accomplish. The way the silences and empty spaces in a poem are crucial to allowing the words that appear on the page to reverberate and sing. Now more than ever, I turn to poetry for its propensity towards truth, its tensile strength, and its insistence that language can and must be the bridge that connects us all during these difficult times. So I've read sort of bits and chunks from that piece just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And now I'll read to you all from a set of new poems, just about 4 of them, that I've been writing since January because, as you all know, the pandemic started off in Asia. And in January, my home city, Hong Kong, was already going through the first wave of COVID-19. And so I already found it seeping into my work sort of unconsciously. Also, I was given a commission by the charity in Manchester called Poets and Players. They wanted me to write something on the theme of altered nature. They didn't sort of explain what it meant. They just wanted something on that theme, which somehow dovetailed really well with, the epidemic and now the pandemic. And so some of these poems are born from that period of reflection. Ars Poetica. I am a poet, I said to my own shame, its perennial flowering of queerphobic introjections. I am a poet, I said to my beloved mother, whose love I once had sufficient reason to doubt. I am a poet, I said to the many wild mouths from which microaggressions and harms flow. I am a poet, I said to the world's rage, its grief. Now I offer this back, the way the trees do. So that first poem was me sort of reflecting on, I suppose, the role of poetry, why write poetry during these times. So I hope to write more sort of in the Ars Poetica vein later on, perhaps for my second collection. This next poem is called Bright Fear, and it was me trying to write about being afraid, essentially, and thinking through also some political events that were happening, with the rise of racism, especially initially when, the outbreak happened, there was a lot of anti-East Asian racism. I remember wearing a mask on public transport to come to Brookes during the last week before lockdown and feeling quite afraid, partly afraid of the virus, but partly afraid of being seen as the virus. I'm sure some of you will be aware of the hashtag I am not a virus, which was sort of trending because a lot of East Asians abroad were feeling that perhaps they were seen as, spreaders of the virus just by virtue of having, yellow skin and being East Asian. And so that kind of fear motivated this poem as well. Bright Fear. 1. During these lengthening days of sunlight and bright fear, there is too much language and too little time. I am afraid. I am left to search for desire indoors, my hands steeped always too long in soap, then the wetness and the drying, to allow once more for soiling, another faint gesture at the enmeshed world, to keep it at bay while keeping it in mind, so I never lose sight of its riven beauty. Today I saw trees and witnessed bodies moving beneath their shade. 2. Before the streets emptied, I would long to dwell in quiet spaces, dreaded long trips underground. Too much of everything kept me on beta blockers as a child. Today, I seek solace in walls and try not to allow the headlines to dictate my days. Bright fear comes to those blessed to live in a country goaded by nostalgia. I display my staff badge like a shield. Lecturer might ward off a fist in dusk or daylight. I walk into classrooms feeling the inward twist of what has come before. Histories, memories, facts. 3. To consider grief a resting place is to understand how it can suddenly surge through the body like a bout of bright fear, how it can seat us firmly on the sofa and leave us there for hours, till our lovers rouse us to eat, to partake in the daily rituals of an ordinary life. All grief at its heart is ordinary. Today I cried again over a bowl of porridge. There is always either too much or too little of it. The salt on my mother's lips, our inability to trust the song of our bodies, the way a tear comes on like a poem. Altered nature. The birds had their tongues tied to silver strings as they hung mid-air in silence. I was kneeling on the wet earth, crying out. A disembodied voice informed me that nectar was being slowly harvested from their throats, that this was the only way. Heat from their flailing bodies pressed my eyes into my skull. I tried to hold myself together in the dream, but could not. Once awake, I could not feel tender. The brutality of all architecture stunned me wherever I looked. What were we, as a species, doing? I finally summoned the will to write life on my to-do list, but kept postponing the task. I had been dreaming of the dying because I could not ignore the news from home, country not so far from the heart. This viral uncertainty keeping me afraid of intimacy. I did not want to touch what others had touched, feared any public surface. Even the air was menacing, invisible droplets omnipresent. A persistent cough soon developed, as if to taunt me. My father, a rheumatologist, texts to say he is well, reminds me he went through the SARS epidemic and never took a day off work. I have inherited this stubborn Calvinist ethic. Today, I return to where breath feels possible. My therapist asks, "What do you want?" I think to myself, mother's gaze, straight gaze, male gaze, white gaze. I am ashamed to confess I want to be reborn as the brother, the beloved son, the future patriarch. I want to see this torso in a different light, to beam on it a kinder gaze as I wait for something to give. I read a poet's words. Mostly, we do not fail to go on living. There is fire on the streets of a city I still love, and fire in the Arctic as the hour ticks on. Had I simply imagined this intimate scene, the mother lying prostrate at the feet of her child, begging for a miracle, or was it the other way around? I'll end with a quick short poem. It's a prose poem, this next one. I've been finding sort of long narrative poems and prose poetry quite liberating recently because maybe there's just so much in the world and so much to kind of parse through and to figure out. The prose poem feels expansive enough to hold all these things together. Whiteness greets me, after Sarah Ahmed. On my train to Oxford, whiteness greets me as a bad habit, a kind of stopping device. I cease to drink from my orange juice as two white men sit opposite me. I try not to assume anything, to continue to inhabit a space of equals. One of them speaks. "All those Chinese people who go to Bicester Village," he murmurs. "You can go into a lift there and hear more than 3 languages these days. Makes you wonder whether you're in England at all." His companion laughs and nods. I stare at my iPhone, sip my orange juice for strength. Perhaps my face, my Chinese face, is a sign they cannot, have chosen not to read. Eventually, I take out a book of poems, placing it on the table between us like a sign. The man looks over, sees that it is in English. He glances at me, quietens, turns the conversation elsewhere. Thank you.